Hey, Eric, do you hear this?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Great round in for time. You guys are great.
I know.
Here. Enjoy it while you can. It's pretty sitting in there.
We have no video, so I can say.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for joining us at Grand Rounds this morning, everyone. I think we sometimes complain about our job being hard, but in the last couple of months, I've been given the two easiest jobs of all time. One, introducing Yoni Buber, and next, introducing Babak Nazer at Grand Rounds and trying to explain what makes each of them special. So for those of you who don't know Babak, he's got an awfully fancy pedigree. He got his master's in science at Johns Hopkins and then his MD at Harvard. He did his internal medicine residency at the Brigham, and then his cardiovascular fellowship and his EP fellowship at UCSF, where he graduated in 2016. After graduating, he joined the faculty at OHSU, where he rose to the rank of associate professor pretty quickly in 2020. The 3-month culture of these suppliers work every day. Gives me and when he stepped up, it was a critical time for us. And when he joined, he not only brought his expertise in complex congenital ablation, but he also brought in a culture of inquisitiveness, collaboration, and
We can't hear audio or something. Or he
really messed with this.
Okay. There we go. All right. So my second disclosure is that I've never commercialized anything, but I've learned a lot about the process by being associated with some projects that you'll hear about that are in various parts of this process and pipeline. And a lot of you over the past year and a few months that I've been here have asked me for my thoughts and advice on some of your even better ideas. And so I was inspired really by my UW colleagues to do this topic. I'm going to take it kind of unorthodox. You'll hear snippets of the research projects and that I've been fortunate to work on, but sort of along the path of talking about the process. But at first, I want to start with an anecdote. It was an anecdote that also happened at Grand Rounds when I was a fellow during the year between my general cardiology fellowship and my EP fellowship, when I took a year to do dedicated research. This picture of this individual on the left is Uday Kumar. He's now a friend and a mentor. And he is trained as an electrophysiologist. He trained where I did maybe 5 to 6 years before me. He finished his EP fellowship, never practiced for a single day. He immediately launched iRhythm, the company that built the Zia patch, which is the predecessor to the Bardy DX cam patch that we prescribe here, and really revolutionized the Holter monitor. It was no longer something on your belt with wires going under your shirt. And Uday and I first met when he asked me to model for iRhythm's first early marketing images for iRhythm. I don't know why you're laughing. But shortly thereafter, he became a mentor to me. And we brought him for Grand Rounds in 2013-ish, around that time. And I remember I was on my postdoc year working on medical device projects with an eye towards commercializing them. And the format of that talk was not a lecture. We set it up as via a Q&A. So one of the more senior professors at UCSF sat down with him and did a Q&A for the first half hour, and then it was Q&A to the audience in the second half hour. And towards the end, one of the cardiologists in the audience had a comment and a question. He said, you know, my fellows and I have a lot of what we think are pretty good ideas, maybe not as great as yours, and we run them by UCSF's tech transfer office, but they never really want to take it to be a company. You know, they hardly even want to do any IP. And Uday's comment still sticks with me to this day. He said to that faculty member, he said, well, are you or any of your fellows willing to quit your day job to run that company? He's like, well, no, I'm a pretty busy interventional cardiologist. I love taking care of patients and doing interventional cardiology. And my fellows are on their way to that too. And they put in a lot of time and we're not ready to quit our day jobs. He said, well, if you're not ready to quit your day job for this idea, how do you expect somebody else to drop what they're doing and build your idea? And that really stuck with me. It's made me reflect on a lot of the ideas that I've had since then, but it also is a challenge accepted moment for me, right? Because I neither then nor now was ready to quit my day job and totally give up clinical care exclusively for commercializing one of my ideas. So here's the rubric I'm going to lay out in the order in which it should be considered. The idea, which we're pretty savvy at, the unmet need, the IP, regulatory, reimbursement, and distribution. But more importantly, or equally importantly, we're going to talk about how you figure out who's going to quote unquote run with it. Who's going to quit their day job or really scale down their day job to actually take it through all these processes. And in reality, from where we are in academics, which is usually more heavily geared to the left side of this chart, right? We're really focused on the idea, as we should be. Academia is often where the ideas start. And we're hardly, if ever, thinking about distribution systems for our ideas decades down the road. And that's probably healthy. So I'll probably present proportionally on that amount of time. So let's start with the idea, right? Is our idea safe and is our idea effective? A lot of the topics I'll present to you in our own projects are heavily in the medical device field, but a lot of what I'll present applies to drugs as well and digital health, which is blowing up. And I'm not going to get into the idea too much. Is it safe? Is it effective? That's what research is. And you all are very good at that in academia, right? You know how to do safety, efficacy, and figure it out to some extent. But it's this third part we often forget about, and it's a trap that I used to fall in really early in my career. Does anybody outside of academia care about it, right? There are a lot of things that are valuable to us. We get published, and that's important, right? We get recognized by our academic peers, but don't have much of a shot of making it because of all the other things down this chart. So I'll move on from the idea, but this third point of does anybody else outside of academia care for it segues nicely to the second bucket, which is the unmet need. What's the unmet need? Some of you know Stanford has a fairly well-renowned biodesign program, which is a one-year program that MDs, MBAs, PhDs can all sign up for. And they actually start with this before they get to the idea. Just find an unmet need. And now I've divided that into two subparts, the market size and the competition of what you think you're trying to do. So I told you you'd learn a little bit about the stuff that I and my colleagues and collaborators work on. So I'm going to pause, go back to 2013 and tell you a tale of two postdocs, because I used to fall into the trap of just trying to figure out what am I interested in? What am I good at? And let me try to find an overlap. And that's not always the path to success. You know, if you're really interested in AFib, huge burden, and you're really good at curing stuff, the overlap of curing AFib with a gigantic market, right? But in reality, in academia, some of us have niche interests, and I would be the poster child of that. So speaking of one of my interests, my research background, dating back to my first ever formative research experiences, is in therapeutic ultrasound. I've taught some of you about what that is, but you should know that you work at the institution that is one of the historically and currently one of the world leaders in therapeutic ultrasound. In cardiology, we all know about diagnostic ultrasound, which was really first described in 1954 by Edler and Hertz. And they initially showed this beautiful A-mode image of showing reflections along the short axis of the heart, which later in gross pathology, each blood tissue interface was a reflection. Quickly built on that with some M-mode that we still kind of use today, again in the 1950s. But what folks don't know is that therapeutic ultrasound, using higher intensities of ultrasound to sometimes thermally ablate, sometimes modulate in other ways tissue, predated that by over a decade. John Lynn first published this study on ex vivo bovine liver, showing that you could make a lesion at depth, avoiding the immediate tissue adjacent to the ultrasound transducer in bovine liver in a dose-dependent manner. This grew, and the Fry brothers demonstrated that you could do proof of principle Parkinson's disease treatment with extracorporeal transcranial focused ultrasound delivery. You can imagine this, the R&D of this took a long while. The first FDA approval was for MRI-guided high-intensity focused ultrasound of uterine fibroids. And this is a device and a company that are still thriving to this day. So 2004 was the first FDA approval. 2014 was the first report of using it clinically for a brain tumor. 2016 was probably the most important seminal manuscript in this field, and it was a multi-center study of transcranial ultrasound for the treatment of essential tremor, showing pretty impressive efficacy and safety. Imagine thinking about how you have to treat the brain through the skull. And that's led me to kind of think of a taxonomy, right? So we have diagnostic ultrasound, we have therapeutic ultrasound, we have non-thermal mechanisms on the left and thermal. Starting with the thermal, that's not that different than other modalities that burn, except for they can do so at great depth and often extracorporeally by focusing the beam. And I put in stars all the different therapeutic ultrasound modalities that have FDA approval. And I put in bold the ones that I got interested in earlier in my career. Cardiac ablation. I was a budding electrophysiologist. It made sense to try to bring my previous research interest in therapeutic ultrasound to my current clinical interest, which was EP and more specifically VT ablation. Then there's this whole bucket of non-thermal effects of ultrasound. And this is when you use the ultrasound at doses below those of thermal ablation, but above those of imaging. And often you pulse the ultrasound instead of treating in CW the way you would if you want to burn things. And this has an FDA approval for thrombolysis, the ECOS catheter, some people may know about. It's actually developed, again, out of the University of Washington Center for Industrial Medical Ultrasound. And then I became interested, before I had kind of clinically diverged from general cardiology / interventional cardiology to EP, became interested in its use for peripheral arterial disease. Because at certain doses, we'd shown that you could increase blood flow through at least vasodilation, maybe even collateral blood vessel growth in animal models of PAD. So having had this formative research experiences during summers home from college at University of Washington at the Center for Industrial Medical Ultrasound, I decided as a postdoc, I would try to take my previous experiences and my clinical interests and just try to smash them together. Okay, that led to two very different postdocs that I did at the same time that grew at very different rates for reasons this commercialization pathway will hopefully elucidate. So I'm going to spare you the 10-year arc and saga of these two projects. Each of those could be their own talk. But briefly, the peripheral arterial disease project moved forward a lot more quickly, and I'll explain why. So the latest and greatest on this is that it's a startup company I'm really just involved with as a consultant, but they're already in sham-controlled human RCTs. The early clinical data in humans shows that the device that they are now taken from my early postdoc work and they really run with it is a wearable array of therapeutic ultrasound transducers placed around the calf of patients with critical limb ischemia with a goal of improving blood flow while it's on and maybe also recruiting collateral blood vessel growth around diffuse infrapopliteal peripheral arterial disease. So spare you the details, but latest and greatest is that it markedly improves blood flow down to the toe. They're now in sham-controlled RCTs looking at more hard clinical endpoints like amputation, revascularization, hospitalization, and gangrene. That moved quickly. It became a company quite early. The NIH was very interested and multiple SBIR grants were awarded to this company along the way, and we'll explain why. The other project that remains, frankly, more near and dear to my heart because it's within EP is high intensity. Dave, your picture isn't supposed to be in the corner of this. It's in some other, oh, there it is. Near and dear to my heart because it's something within my clinical specialty is using ultrasound for ablation for VT. And Dave Giroux, one of my dear friends and engineering collaborators in the audience today, really did a lot of vast majority of the true engineering of this work. But again, to distill our 7-year-long collaboration down to half of a slide, we build ultrasound ablation catheters, frankly, Dave does, characterize them, single element, side facing, and ablate the myocardium, initially for the treatment of VT. We have data on epicardial treatment and then more recently endocardial treatment can make lesions from the RV to the LV and make lesions much deeper than we can with radiofrequency, which is shallow, ablates what's immediately underneath the surface, which is often the His-Purkinje system. We can ablate from RV to LV and drop the lesion right in the middle of the septum. A lot of MRI work validated that LG would be present acutely and chronically. So I said I'd tell you why one of these ideas moved more quickly, got a lot of NIH, SBIR funding early, now private investor funding, and that drills to the unmet need, the market size and the competition. Let's compare the two, okay? So on the left is a few figures related to PAD, gigantic market, right? If you look at all PAD, including asymptomatic low ABI patients, 18 million people in the US, 6 million have symptomatic PAD with claudication, and 2 million have critical limb ischemia. Huge market, right? Outcomes for these patients are poor, and that we'll get to that with the competition conversation. But look at arrhythmia ablation. In the early days of this project, every time I would meet with industry partners, Abbott, Biosense, J&J, Medtronic, first question they would ask me is, does it work for AFib? It doesn't, right? AFib is not a depth problem. The atrium's 3 millimeters thick. VT is a depth problem. And unfortunately, then and still today, AFib dwarfs VT ablation by a 9-to-1 margin. It's huge. And the gap might be closing, but it might also separate in the future too. So we were facing this uphill battle from the early days, both with the strategic partners and frankly, even funding agencies, including NIH. So back when we were both at OHSU, Dave and I put our heads together and we said, well, how do we expand our potential market size? How do we get people interested, even at an academic and funding level? And we made this surprising and fortunate observation that when we would survive these animals, the ones in whom we'd focused on the septum for a month, their septum would shrink. It would shrink by gross pathology, it would shrink by MRI, it would shrink by echo, and you would decrease its thickness by about 35%. And we were fortunate to be at a big HCM center previously. And I don't want to say we pivoted, but we augmented our clinical applications by adding HCM to the mix. So let's talk a little bit about that market size and unmet need. So it's estimated there's about 1.5 million patients in the US with HCM, 1 million of whom have the obstructive variant, right, obstructive subtype. And not all these patients need septal reduction therapies, right? It would be silly for me to say that, but many more do than the current number of therapies that are being provided annually. About 1,200 patients get septal reduction therapy, and some of these are redos, so it's actually fewer individual people. 500 a year myectomies and 700 alcohol septal ablations. And I think we all know that both of these can really only be done by expert operators. Not every surgeon can do a myectomy well. Not every interventionalist can do an ASA very well. So huge potential room for growth here. There's actually a third application, which my interventional structural colleagues have created for me. And this is a neo-LV outflow tract obstruction, right? With these fancy TMVR, especially the transcatheter mitral valves that are being put in. If patients even have that septal knuckle, not formal HCM, but what we sometimes call angulated septum of the elderly or ASH, whatever you want to call it, putting in a fairly large and rigid transcatheter mitral valve can shove the septal leaflet of the mitral over to that septal knuckle and create neo-LV outflow tract obstruction. And so that was kind of added to our market mix. So conservatively, we now have pitched to our grant reviewers, industry partners, that we have a device that could potentially treat about 30%, 30,000 patients per year, if you assume just a 10% of the VT market share, and a little bit of increase in the HCM market share and about 5,000 of these TMVR patients. But what about the competition? So in the early days of HCM, it was easy to make a good case for the competition leaving us an open door, right? This is a study looking at hospital volume, it's the 3 different shades of green, as it relates to complication rates of septal myectomy on the left and alcohol septal ablation on the right. So on the left is death. You can see in the lowest tertile of volume, perioperative mortality with myectomy is astronomical, right? Double digits. Gets better as we get to high volume centers. Pacemaker rates were high across the board, about 10%. And then all of the complications are certainly palpable. Death rates are lower with alcohol septal ablation, but again, low volume operators, 2% mortality rate in the first 30 days. Expert operators, virtually zero, but pacemakers rates are high. It's very hard to control where the alcohol will go. So in the early days, we had a pretty good case for not a lot of competition in the HCM world. Let's talk about PAD. PAD had even less competition. In the group of PAD patients, I kind of don't do that much PAD anymore, obviously, but I still think of it as above the knee disease, below the knee disease, and then either focal or diffuse. Folks in the audience may have more insight here, but if patients have disease above the knee that's focal, most of the existing therapies, balloon angioplasty, bypass, stents work pretty well with pretty low recurrence rates. These numbers here, I didn't explicitly state it, are composite recurrence rates of revascularization, amputation, revascularization plus amputation, down in the single digits. But as the disease moves below the knee, we move to the 20% range, right, for all the existing therapies. And if it's below the knee and diffuse, there's almost nothing for it. The latest thing is this thing called limb flow, where they're connecting the distal vein and artery and getting the vein to actually perfuse the foot, which may have some efficacy. But the competition was and still is pretty wimpy for the PAD postdoc. The HCM has become crowded, and somewhat with Jamie McCabe and his Sesame thing. That deserves its own grand rounds unto itself. But myectomy and ASA are still there. There's beautiful work being done by Jamie and his colleagues on a very innovative procedure that I just love that I'm loosely associated with it at the same institution. Mavacamten, aficamten, other selective myosin inhibitors, those on one hand could shrink the septal reduction therapy market, but on the other hand could bring a lot of undiagnosed patients out of the woodwork, right? Bristol Myers Squibb and Cytokinetics are pushing hard to screen patients with dyspnea for HCM. So that could be a mixed bag. And then for our ultrasound ablation, getting back to VT, we've got a lot of competition there. All right, so I'm going to move on from unmet need to the IP process, okay? A lot of folks at the academic level get a little nervous when it comes to IP. What if there's something else filed on it? And my goal here is to tell you, you should do your search. USPTO and Google Patent are two very somewhat user-friendly resources. Reach out to UW CoMotion's office. I'll refer to CoMotion a lot, but one of the many reasons I joined this institution is that UW's tech transfer office is actually world-class. Every tech transfer office has frustrations, but of the three that I've worked with, they're the easiest and most aggressive and frankly best. Statistically, they're second only to MIT in total number of patents filed. And then the top 5 for number of startup companies. So we're very fortunate to work here if we're interested in this field. And file your invention disclosure early. If you have an idea and it's spun out of UW, disclose to them early. There's no very little downside to you. And they will help with the patent search. But don't let any existing IP discourage you, right? First of all, a lot of IP are provisional patents. Someone will spend anyone can write something on an envelope, give $250 to US Patent Office and mail that envelope in, you'll get a provisional patent. It's not hard. So try to sort out, are these just provisional patents that were filed, someone had an idea and they never ran with it, just filed it and let it go? Or is it really a fully issued patent? Both can still hinder you, but a lot of very successful medical devices built upon pre-existing patents. Some of them were able to license them, but a lot of times the actual IP underlying a device that we frequently use is not for the actual device. It's for some tiny widget that made it successful. Does that make sense? I can provide some examples if anyone wants to later offline. So don't get too discouraged and certainly don't shelve your idea if you find that there was a patent in your USPTO search. Someone else thought of it. Does that make sense? All right. Let's move from IP to the regulatory pathways. This was the most intimidating of all of the process for me early on. It's partially because it's a field of alphabet soup. There are so many abbreviations and acronyms, and it can be kind of daunting. And I still sometimes, when I'm on my phone call with more commercial savvy investors, like some of Dave and my collaborators in New York City, will pause them and say, can you tell me what that acronym was? Because in my field, it means non-ischemic cardiomyopathy. You know what I mean? And so I'm going to break this down for you a little bit and teach you some of the alphabet soup. But regulatory breaks down into 2 steps. What does it take for us to be able to test our idea in a human, in the US anyway? There's a whole outside of US world out there that's a little easier. And then what does it take to get the device FDA approved to use clinically in a human? Those are 2 very different regulatory steps, but they both fall under regulatory. They both have their alphabet soup. So let's start with the first one, right? And talk about what infrastructure there is at UW for this. So what does it take to be able to test it on a human? Well, you've got to do your preclinical testing, usually in animals, in what's called a GLP environment, good labor and practices, right? And you hear this term GLP if you're in this field. When I was new to this field, I thought GLP had to have a plaque on the wall, right? We couldn't be GLP. If someone has to come inspect and give you a plaque saying you are a GLP lab, that's not how it works, right? A lot of private contract labs are GLP. The way GLP works, it's actually just a method of documenting how your lab is built, maintained, inspected, and most importantly, how the procedures are done with a series of SOPs, standard operating procedures. And there's no pre-research accreditation to say, oh, this work you're about to do will count for GLP when it comes to us evaluating. There could be a back-end audit, right? If it's the first time you've ever submitted an FDA submission, they may say, well, we don't know you. You say you did this under GLP. We're going to be by next Thursday. So it could be a back-end audit, but it's really just the way you conduct your research, okay, with SOPs. V&V, verification and validation. This falls to the real engineers in the audience, but this is a method of building and checking and double checking and validating, one of the V's, your devices that fall under what are called ISO, International Standards Organization certifications, using something called quality systems documentation method. A lot of alphabet soup. This is probably the hardest one to formally do in academia, right? GLP, our colleagues within Center for Industrial and Medical Ultrasound that work with me and Dave, they've done a ton of GLP work and they've submitted many other devices to FDA. V&V can be hard to do in academia. This often requires contract engineering labs to take your device and just double check everything. QSub. QSub is the FDA's way of saying submit something to us. So once you've got your GLP data, safety and efficacy and preclinical models and your V&V done, you package it and send it as a QSub. And the FDA will review it and hopefully give you an IDE, investigational device exemption. Those who are drug related, they'll then give you an IND, investigational new drug something. With that, you can start an FIH, first in human, EFS, early feasibility study. It's a lot of alphabet soups out there, but this is the ones on the path to testing your device. What about getting it approved, right? So you do the first step, you get your IDE, and you got to do all your studies, which depending on what kind of device you want, there'll be fewer or more of them. But what about getting it approved? So at least in medical devices, there are sort of 3 different pathways to FDA approval, depending on your risk of device. 510K are thought of as medium risk devices. It's often something that's equivalent to something that's already marketed. It's a device that is not imminently determining the patient's mortality. Example would be, a fancy new kind of IV catheter tubing or an irrigation pump for cooling the esophagus to prevent atrioesophageal fistulas. These are 510K pathways often used for follow-along devices. We see this thing in the market, we can make it better with this small widget, and it's not something that's, a ventilator, for example. The more restrictive and challenging path is PMA, pre-market approval. These are, and I quoted the FDA here, support or sustain human life, importance in preventing impairment of human health, present a potential unreasonable risk of illness or injury. More rigorous safety and efficacy data is usually required. So our HCM and VT ablation catheter is most certainly going to be a PMA path. Okay, it's going to be more rigorous. Then there's this new one. It's new by evidence of its name, de novo classification. And that's kind of when things are in the middle. And the FDA built this largely in response to the digital health world, right? It's hard to know, depending on what digital health is doing. Is it going to really just be a 510K? Because it could be trying to detect arrhythmia, right, from an Apple Watch, or is it really PMA? Well, it's not really determining life or death. So this is everything else falls in this bucket. And so the PAD company is actually likely going to be a de novo classification. If your device or idea is really a PMA path, don't be discouraged. It actually gives you a little protection on the back end because 510Ks are very easy to follow along. People can copy your work, right? PMAs, if someone tries to make something similar to you, they've got to go through the whole PMA process from the beginning. With a 510K, you can just say, here's a previous 510K someone else approved. We are very similar. We just improved this one little thing. Can we have our 510K? And it's a lot easier. So don't be discouraged if your feedback from CoMotion or your mentors is, no, you got to go down a PMA path. But it is going to take longer. So I kind of already spoke to this. All right. Yeah, and with that, go ahead. Hang on, Bill. Wait, people want to know what you say. Bill Lombardi's in the audience. This is gold. I'm taking notes.
The issue though, he also says the FDA, the PMA is also so you can talk about what it's for, right? I mean, 60% of the things we use in a cath lab aren't indicated for what we use, right? Because getting things indicated is super hard. So a lot of times you can see people take a 510K pathway, get it approved, then have people learn to use it. Then you can go back and do a PMA because you want to broaden your market, be able to have a sales force talk about it. But you have to understand these pathways partly are, do you want to just be able to sell it, or do you want to be able to educate on it? Because those are also very different pathways in this process and are really important, because you may focus so much on, but I want to be able to talk about it. Well, you may run out of venture capital and cash because the PMI trials are really expensive. 510Ks are pretty easy. So I think it's important as you go that process, you got to think, can I stage it? And how important is each step? Academia, we're always like, well, we want the PMA trial. We want to prove we're academically brilliant. Where most companies like, I don't care. I just want to start making cash. So you got to think about that.
You're totally right. And startups will run out of money before the PMA data is in. So because you brought up that excellent nuance, last I heard, the Vibrato company is actually going to get a 510K. They're, on Series A level of runway lasting a matter of years, not decades. So they're going to get a 510K with fairly loose claims of improving blood flow, and then later get a de novo classification to treat critical limb ischemia. So you're right. The best example is in my world is there are actually no FDA-approved VT ablation catheters. We ablate VT all the time, but you'll never see, if you look closely, Biosense will never say that the Thermocool is a VT ablation catheter, because it does the same thing in the atrium, but every EP ablation catheter is approved for the treatment of AFib. Right? But we can use it for whatever we want, and no one will call us out on it as long as it's safe. And they're okay with that. They don't need to redo PMA. They know we're just using it. Great point, Bill. And please, it goes without saying, and many people in the audience who are further along and well better versed in this than I am. So please do cut me off, and I'm going to leave time for conversation. All right, reimbursement. Each of these could be an hour unto itself, but I'll break it down in a somewhat digestible manner. Sorry? Yeah, it's true. Yeah. I mean, there's like a regulatory master's degree program at UW, right? It's the DDAC program. We'll talk about that too. So reimbursement, again, it's not something that's going to be the forefront of your mind, but you should have, if you're going to want to carry conversations with folks who can help you on this path, you should know that that's something that they're thinking about and be able to speak to it. I'm going to break it down. There's more nuance to this, but I think of it as, it going to be direct to patient? Is it going to be insurance or CMS, the standard prescribe and get reimbursed pathway? Or is it going to be licensing to a strategic partner? The vast majority of stuff coming out of academia falls to number 3. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But let's start with direct to patient. So another project I've been involved with briefly only since coming to UW, and this is way out of left field. You're all going to say, why the heck is an electrophysiologist working on this? But getting back to the traps that I fell into earlier in my career, trying to take my clinical expertise and my research expertise and shove them together and make something out of it, which has gone great. More recently, I've just been trying to think about unmet needs and finding smarter people to help me solve them. And I think one of them that's been personally affected me is the colon cancer epidemic. And, with the USPTF dropping the colonoscopy age to 45 instead of 50, it's come closer to my forefront of my frontal lobe. But it's a problem, right? The compliance rate with colonoscopy back when it was 50 years was 40% compliance, right? With USPTF recommendations. It's going to get worse. I'm probably going to make it a little bit worse at 45. So it's a gigantic market. Dwarfs PAD, definitely dwarfs HCM septal reduction therapy. And I kind of had this idea. Dave and I spoke about it between jobs. We never wrote anything on paper. And there's got to be a way with optical imaging to detect blood and stool for patients who don't want an invasive option. And frankly, with Dave's help connected with, one of the things that make you really happy to be at UW, a world expert in medical optics, right? Steve Jacques is one of the world's experts in the way light interacts with tissues and body fluids. He's already commercialized devices looking non-invasively detecting bilirubinemia in neonates. We started working together, me and Steve, and then we connected with Cynthia Ko, who's a real gastroenterologist. And this is a very early project, but I bring it up during the direct-to-patient reimbursement path because that's probably going to be the ultimate path if this ever takes off. With a series of experiments that are too gross to describe, we showed that with increasing concentration of blood in stool, we could actually derive a blood score that would increase. And, CoMotion is very supportive of this. And ultimately, what's it going to be? It's either going to utilize your existing smartphone camera, or more likely, it's going to be an LED light attachment to your camera that will use special wavelengths that Steve has really kind of found that are unique to detecting blood, but also improving specificity, right? And dealing with patient-to-patient variability in diet and things like that. Long path here, but I use this project as an example of a direct-to-patient reimbursement path. This is the most likely way it's going to go. All right, so insurance CMS, I think we're all pretty well versed in that. At least the clinicians in the audience are, but let's talk about licensing paths, because I think that's the most common one that will come out of academia, especially if getting back to who's going to run with it, if we don't want to quit our day jobs, right? Which I still don't want to do. So this licensing path is the last project that I've been associated with that I'm going to share with you. And I set the stage for ultrasound early, right? Ultrasound turns, we put in voltage, we get pressure out. Sound is just pressure. Ultrasound is just pressure. So that's something I've been fairly well versed in, at least for an MD. But the process of doing that can go both ways. Ultrasound transducers are part of a class of materials called piezoelectrics, and that property works both ways. And again, in the between jobs period, not writing things on paper, Dave and I used to speak about this. And the idea that we had was, well, why not take the Micra, or the leadless pacemaker, which really has no great generator change path to it, right? Once it's in, it's in. It's sitting in the RV. You've got an oscillating pressure of the right ventricle. They're not as high as the left ventricle, but it's something there. And convert that pressure backward, the reverse piezoelectric effect, into voltage. We're certainly not the first people to ever think of this. Energy harvesting has a long, history and publication path. Not a lot of commercialized examples of it in the heart. But we early on, when we moved to UW, connected with Dr. Malakuti, who is mechanical engineering and really a biomaterials expert and a piezo expert. And this is the idea that came along: convert the RV pressure using a jacket around the leadless pacemaker, really just replacing its housing, ideally not changing its size, form factor, or delivery method, to use piezos to prolong the battery life. We have a team of students that called themselves Piezo Pulse, and we'll talk about some of that. The goal of prolonging battery life, reducing the need for reimplantations, and then expanding access to younger groups of patients, all right? Because right now, at least in EP, we look at a patient who's estimated to live 40 more years, they're going to need 4 leadless pacemakers, and you're not going to fill the right ventricle up with AAA batteries. One of the companies is marketing themselves as retrievable. Yeah, I'm sure he will. But does he want to do 1,000 of those, right? Or does he want to do things that will help patients, right? And put in valves. Do you really want to take things out? I don't know. So, we've met with Abbott and about to meet with Medtronic and Biotronic on this. This would likely be a licensing play, because to start a de novo pacemaker company, especially a leadless pacemaker, it makes no sense for anybody, let alone an academic person. Here are just some of our students' preliminary data. So the design that worked the best of the three was to layer PVDF, which is the piezoelectric material that ultimately ended up being optimal for this method, and roll it, really kind of like a, I don't know, roll you bake with, around with this dumbbell shaped with inert material, which would represent the circuitry and the existing battery. And they created a prototype, put it in a cardiac simulation chamber, and showed with RV pressures, we got a little generous, gave our fake patients with pulmonary hypertension of 40/5 RV pressure, could generate a voltage output that was in phase and the same frequency as the heartbeat, which is more than some other investigators who've tried to do this have been able to show. And basically doing the calculations that right now where we are only harvests about 10% of the power needed to pace the next beat. So a lot of work to do. These are long shots, but an example of a likely licensing path if it ever makes it there. All right. Last but not least is the distribution network. And we really shouldn't be spending a lot of our mental energy on this, but this actually links closely with the licensing conversation, which is why I use that as a segue to get to this. Because again, like, not only is it unlikely that we would quit our day jobs and build our own leadless pacemaker company around this harvesting idea, but then you got to build a sales force, right? So in reality, when you think about distribution, how do we get our device out to providers and or patients, depending on the reimbursement pathway we've chosen? You want to think about that when it comes to the strategic partners you reach out with. Who has sales forces in these areas? So I'll put the 4 projects I've already discussed here and talk about our approach to that. So the PAD company has a wealth of options, right? They can look at the PAD stent and device companies, and I've listed them here, and say, you're already selling all these devices. They have ridiculously high recurrence rates. You could market this with your existing sales force as an adjunct therapy to angioplasty, stents, whatever, right? You don't want to market to them as a replacement. It doesn't help to say we're going to make you bankrupt. We'll just crush you. But there's also the ultrasound imaging companies that have a little bit of therapy interests is another path for them. So Siemens, GE, and Philips, they're ultrasound companies. We know them as ultrasound companies. Some of them have some footprint in different therapeutics. And so could they want to build on their impressive ultrasound infrastructure to shift further from imaging to therapy? Yeah, we would love to be their next poor choice. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's why Shockwave and Inari actually may be the 2 best ones. They're smaller companies. That's why some of you may not know their names, but Shockwave is $3 billion market share and ready to start buying stuff. You? I know. Yeah, I know Todd Brinton kind of well. Yeah, I'll move on. Good. We'll get the microphone around later. Thank you. Thanks, David. So let's move on to the second idea, the HCM VT ablation catheter. So who have Dave and I have been speaking to? The EP companies, right? There's a challenging one though, because the EPs have some footprint with HCM, but we're not the ones managing the patients, right? The David Owens of the world are managing the patients. So you got to do a lot of convincing of 2 different parties. But what about the structural heart companies, right? Certainly for that neo LV outflow tract obstruction example I gave you, that's a great sell. So could you go through the folks that make the valves and say, well, we can expand your valve market by opening up this LV outflow tract for you before or after your valve goes in? Occult blood imaging, I have to admit, a bit of a black box to me, and something that's such an early project, haven't really gotten to that part yet. And then that energy harvesting leadless pacemaker is much less of a black box. There are 2 companies that make these and 2 that are about to make their own. And so that's 4. All right, hardest part. Who's going to run with it, right? Getting back to the anecdote of grand rounds in 2013 with Uday. So do you want to quit your day job? Hopefully none of you do. If your idea is good enough and or you're sufficiently bored of clinical care, that may be the right time to do it. I hope it's not, because I like working with all of you. But if you do, don't forget who taught you everything you know. The medical device incubators. So we've been very fortunate through some connections that we've had to partner with a medical device incubator based out of New York City called Caridia, which is part of a VC called Deerfield Catalyst. Very fortunate. They have the V&V and quality systems skills, or at least close connections, to help us with taking that next step to get an IDE and an EFS. Now you know your alphabet soup. So this is a group that we work with very closely. They come out here. We're hopefully going to go out to New York, and we hold an SBIR grant with them. So incubators can be helpful. They'll take some of your IP, and they'll take some of your theoretical equity if you're at that stage, but they can really help you bridge that gap if there's the V&V and the FDA regulatory gap if you can't. And they also think about the licensing, distribution, and reimbursement better than we do, because they live and breathe it more than we do. Co-motion. So they're not going to run with it. All right. People think tech transfer office, as my original anecdote at Grand Rounds 10 years ago, are going to do it all. But every once in a while, there are some entrepreneurs and residents they have in their bullpen. These are folks who love jumping from startup to startup and are often talking to tech transfer offices in their region, or if they're willing to move all over. And they're like, when you have the right project that's ready to launch a company, I'll do it for equity, right? So they'll become the CEO and start the company for you. This is not easy. These aren't a dime a dozen, but co-motion can help find out if there's anyone who really might be willing to run with it if you don't want to quit your day job. The UW Masters in Applied Bioengineering has been an awesome program to be affiliated with. This is a one-year master's degree, and the students take some classes, but the majority of their year is dedicated toward one idea, right? And so I've been fortunate to mentor two groups. I'm in my second year of this, and every once in a while, one of these students loves the project so much that after the master's year is up, they're like, my next job is going to be to start this company. That hasn't happened to me in these 2 years, but there are examples of that. And so mentorship in academia can pay off in even more ways than we already know it does. That's a picture of last year's group. They won a prize at the Holloman Health Innovation Challenge, which is next Thursday, if anyone wants to go on the hub on the main campus for the subsequent years. And they did the energy harvesting pacemaker project. And then EIH is a program run through mechanical engineering. These are not folks, these are students, again, usually seniors, undergrad, and some master's students, a few PhD students, but they're not fully protected to do it. They're doing it sort of on the side. But they also have a lot of good track record, and when they graduate, some of them may choose to run with the project that you mentored them on. So it's also a formal UW-based program, and I've guided some faculty. A few other resources to know about. CoMotion has a bunch of funding options for ideas that may not be classically fundable by NIH, right, or more R&D, more of the D side of R&D than the R side of R&D. Innovation Gap Fund is one. We were fortunate to get one. Bryce and Kelly Branch got one of these. WeReach is through the Washington Research Foundation. It's very similar to Innovation Gap Fund. Both of these programs, during the application process, even if you don't get the grant, give you some free mentorship and guidance for all those bins that we put up along this pathway. ITHS, the UW subsidiary, has a grant called Early Stage Product Development Award, and they also have a program called DDAC, Drug and Device Advisory Committee. They have their own master's program for people interested in learning the regulatory pathways, and they'll do a free regulatory assessment for your idea. You just meet with them, tell them what your idea is, and they'll chart the future for you. And then SBIR grants from NIH, probably the hugest sum of money for this, and it's non-dilutive funding, it's free money, but it's not easy. One, the submitting agency has to be a company, so you kind of have to quit your day job or convince someone else to. That person has to work at least 50% for that company, so you can't find somebody who has like 4 hours a week and make them a fake CEO. It's a real deal. But if the stars align, this was very helpful in the early days of Vibrato to get your ideas off the ground. And I've put up the whole rubric and all of its subparts here, and I think I'll end my talk and turn it over for questions.
Thank you for the rubric. Under the reimbursement and under the licensing section, and you mentioned with your energy harvesting pacemaker that you've been talking to some of the big companies. That project is somewhat young still. How do you protect yourself and your idea when you're like talking to the big guys that can invest millions into this?
Yeah, the first thing you want to do is file your disclosure. You don't necessarily need the CoMotion office to have written your patent, but in our case, they had by the time we contacted these folks. But if you file your disclosure, UW formally, puts it in that this was disclosed and discussed, and then you got your time in your line in the sand per se. The other way to do it is to ask them to sign an NDA, but usually the smaller guy or gal can't ask the bigger guy or gal in the conversation to sign an NDA for these conversations. So you should make sure that the CoMotion knows you're having a conversation. It's certainly if it's a UW idea. If it's not a UW idea, you did it in your garage on nights and weekends, your IP lawyer should know you're having these conversations. Probably don't ask them for an NDA, but don't tell them too much, right? Don't show your, I didn't even show you guys our secret sauce to whatever extent you could argue we have one. Don't show them your secret sauce. Show them broad strokes, what you can do. Show them your results at the end without showing them the nitty gritty of what went into it. Bill? No.
Yeah, very interesting. So, getting back to the advice of your former colleague about dropping the shop. So, clearly it worked for him. But I think, the history of advice development is really full of counterexamples. Swan and Gans, they didn't stop practicing cardiology. There are a number of medical devices that can be used for intervention by people in practice. So, I mean, is that really necessary?
No, I don't think it's necessary to quit your day job. I think that's what I'm trying to impress upon you all. You have to be patient if you don't quit your day job, because it's going to be slow. It's going to be way slower. Bill, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, the other is how much money you want to make off of it.
Yeah.
I mean, the issue is one, when Swan and Gans built products, the environment was totally different. I mean, it was the Wild West. Getting venture capital, the comment I was going to make is when you get into these discussions, because you didn't even talk about venture capital, where you paid for all this, you did it through grants. That's not the normal pathway. The normal pathway is actually venture capital. And when you get into a room and start talking money, you're the dumbest person in the room. You think you're smart because you've got a great education, you're a doctor, you've done all this stuff. When you start talking about money, you're the dumbest person in the room. And so you either better have great representation or you better do a lot of homework. Because when you go talk to big companies about licensing and you talk to VCs, I mean, I watched a buddy of mine get screwed out of $6 million simply because the VC board didn't want him to commercialize their device. And they brought in a guy who worked for 11 months and took 7 million home. So I think that's a really important process. Physicians tend to think they're way smarter in areas outside of medicine than they actually are, and you need to be very careful about that. The other question I want to ask you is, my experience is peer review is actually harmful to innovation, right? And we're very focused on peer review in academics. Do you want to give an opinion on, do you think the peer review process creates innovation or hinders innovation in medicine?
Well, I think the pressure to eventually publish creates, because we got to keep thinking of new and cool things that will interest people. It can hinder you practically in one way. Publishing or even presenting in an abstract, because some of those end up as, tiny little thing in a journal, can actually invalidate your IP. So if you are thinking of submitting something device related, for example, the Lilly's pacemaker, before we even submitted it to AHA for just an abstract, let alone a publication, have to have your conversator's co-motion, because your own abstract could invalidate your own IP later. Does that make sense? So if your disclosure didn't go in, or ideally a provisional patent, before you give the talk at AHA and it went in after, even though you gave the talk, it could invalidate your IP. So that's a practical way in which peer review and the academic path could hinder. But I think our pressure to, and in parallel with the clinical care we provide, be thinking of cool new things is ultimately helping. So to balancing those out, I think it's a net neutral. And I want to answer another part of David's question to the point of, is it necessary to quit your day job? It's, for me, the way I've thought about it as I ruminate on these things, it's got to be a balance of how great is the idea and how bored am I of clinical care? That's really what it's got to be, right? It's really got to be. And I mean, on average, people get, unless they shift to a new specialty or something, a little bit bored of their niche of clinical care over time. It can just seem repetitive to some, right? And to the point of a good idea, the statistics show that at the seed level, defined by an NIH SBIR phase 1 award or any investment under $1 million. So any medical device at the seed level of investment has a 1 in 36 chance of ever reaching commercialization, successful exit, or licensing, right? So 1 in 36. So you got to know your odds, right? So if your idea is good, but not great, and you still love your day job, combination of clinical medicine, admin, and run-of-the-mill research, may not make sense to take those odds.
Thank you.
Oh.
So I think you did a great job of showing the miles of work in between an idea and commercialization, and everyone's got an idea. How do those ideas come out of conversations with people that then never go on to do the work that it takes to bring it forward? What advice do you have about the people that you generated the ideas with? Maybe you were having coffee with someone at AHA and you guys are banding about, we should, figure out how to generate power from the heart. And then they disappear, never to put in the legwork. What pitfalls have you seen in terms of those people coming back later and say, hey, this was my idea. but they never took steps 2 through 2000 to do the work.
Yeah, I think the two answers to that are building a network of people who are smarter than you, is certainly from an engineering and business perspective, and also trying to be inclusive. So both Steve Jacques and Mohammed Malakouti were identified by Dave. You know, he was recruited to be an engineer at CMU around the time when y'all recruited me here. And that was fortunate for me for many reasons. But also, when I thought of these two ideas, he worked at UW and studied at UW. I said, listen, you know UW and certainly the engineering school better than I do. Can we both do like a deep dive of the engineering faculty? And I got to give it to him. He's like, talk to this guy Malakouti for your pacemaker idea. And then he knows Steve Jacques, who overlapped with him at OHSU, never overlapped with me. So ask people who've been at your institution longer about who has the right skill set, but also reputation. He could attest to Steve's reputation, and he could evaluate Malakouti's skill set better than I could. And then once you identify those people, their responsiveness to emails and it often speaks for itself, and you can just sense people's enthusiasm of whether they're going to follow through or not. I didn't put pictures of the 4 other engineering faculty that we met with, and they never really followed up. That's why they didn't make the slide deck. Yeah, I mean, Steve Jacques' zeal for doing those early stool experiments was sometimes overwhelming, but you knew he was in it. And then you got to be inclusive. So both of those individuals are on the IP, right? Sure, I may have thought of it and gone to them, but it never would get anywhere without their existence. So these are co-inventor patents. Any grants that we're writing are, one of them is PI, I'm co-PI, you know, depending on the mechanism. So you just got to be inclusive once they've demonstrated that they're going to do it. Chinonso, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful conversations. You know, I think I'm really struck by the using the body's energy to enhance the, you know, the energy storage or function of a pacemaker. Were you guys using the original micro pacemaker or the AV micro? And
Neither. Right now, it's a cylinder
okay,
that's filled with a block of metal to simulate a
Okay.
leadless pacemaker.
okay,
Yeah, ultimately, you know, if once you prove the principle, the size and shape of the Avir and the Micra and the pipeline products, other companies are not that different. One's a little
Yeah.
longer and thinner, one's a little shorter and fatter. But right now, we're just at the make a cylinder that's the same size and see if you can do this.
and it seems to me, you know, like we have so much potential energy in the body that's available to harvest. I think that, you know, it's possible one day. I think one day that puzzle will be figured out. And I think one other challenge is, how do you convince device makers that this is a good idea? You know, if theoretically you had a pacemaker that never needed a generator change, right? It would be, how would you convince them that it's a good idea to do that?
Yeah, that question I can't answer in less than 15 minutes. It's really hard to convince them. And you may never convince them. And the good thing about our job is certainly this kind of work is worst case scenario. If you never convince them, you end up having mentored 8 master's degree students, very enriching interactions, published 1 to 2 papers, presented 2 to 3 AHA or HRS abstracts, and it's still a win because that is valued in our jobs. So if you don't convince them, that's one of the benefits of not quitting your day job. Like, it's still valued. I like to think you guys value this even if none of these ever get commercialized. So I'll answer that question offline because it's hard.
All right, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of Grand Round. That was an extraordinary talk on a topic